The day I watched my marriage collapse wasn't when Claire handed me the divorce papers. It wasn't when she told me she didn't love me anymore, her voice hollow like someone reading from a script they'd been forced to memorize. No, my marriage truly ended on a Tuesday evening in November when I found myself sitting alone in an empty apartment that used to be our home, staring at a manila envelope that contained proof of a conspiracy so calculated, so deliberately cruel, that even now, 3 years later, my hands shake when I think about it. Inside that envelope was evidence that my father-in-law, Richard Thornton, a man who had shaken my hand at his daughter's wedding and called me son, had spent 4 years systematically dismantling every aspect of my life. He destroyed my career. He poisoned my marriage. He turned the woman I loved into a stranger who looked at me with suspicion and eventually contempt. And he did all of it because I had the audacity to marry his daughter without his permission, because I came from nothing, and because I refused to bend to his will. This is the story of how I discovered the truth, how I fought back against a man who thought his wealth and power made him untouchable, and how I made him pay for every single lie he ever told. My name is Marcus Bennett, and if you've ever been betrayed by someone who was supposed to be family, then you know exactly how deep that wound can cut. I need to take you back to the beginning, to the night I first met Claire Thornton at a charity gala in downtown Chicago. I was 28 years old, and I had no business being at an event like that. The ticket alone cost more than my monthly rent, but my boss at the marketing firm where I worked had given me his invitation because his wife had gone into labor that afternoon. He told me to go, to network, to make something of the opportunity. I remember feeling completely out of place in my rented tuxedo, surrounded by people who wore wealth like a second skin. I was nursing a glass of champagne in the corner, trying to look like I belonged, when I saw her. Claire was standing near the silent auction table, laughing at something a friend had said, and I swear the entire room seemed to dim around her. She had this light brown hair that fell in waves past her shoulders, and when she smiled, it was genuine in a way that felt rare among the polished socialites around us. I didn't approach her that night. I was too intimidated, too aware of the gap between her world and mine. But fate, or whatever you want to call it, had other plans. 2 weeks later, I walked into a coffee shop near my office, and there she was, sitting alone with a book, looking nothing like the glamorous woman from the gala. She was wearing jeans and an oversized sweater, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, and somehow she was even more beautiful. I still don't know where I found the courage, but I walked up to her table and said the first thing that came to mind. I told her I'd seen her at the gala and that I'd spent 2 weeks kicking myself for not saying hello. She looked up at me, studied my face for a moment, and then she smiled. That smile changed everything. She told me to sit down. We talked for 3 hours that day. I learned that Claire was a kindergarten teacher, which surprised me given her family's obvious wealth. She told me she'd never wanted to be part of the business world that consumed her father and older brother. She wanted to make a difference in a way that felt real, and teaching children was her version of that. She asked about my life, and I told her the truth. I grew up in a working-class neighborhood on the south side of Chicago. My father was a mechanic who worked 60-hour weeks until his back gave out, and my mother cleaned houses for families that probably knew the Thorntons. I put myself through college on scholarships and student loans, and I'd clawed my way into a decent position at a marketing firm through sheer determination. Claire didn't flinch at any of it. She didn't look at me with pity or condescension. She looked at me like I was something remarkable, like my story made me more interesting, not less. By the time we finally left that coffee shop, the sun had set, and the barista was giving us pointed looks. Claire wrote her number on a napkin, and when our fingers touched as she handed it to me, I felt something shift in my chest. I knew even then that this woman was going to matter. I just didn't know that loving her would eventually cost me everything. Our relationship moved quickly after that. We had dinner the following weekend, then brunch the weekend after. Within a month, we were seeing each other almost every day. Claire introduced me to her friends. most of whom were surprisingly down to earth, despite their privileged backgrounds. She took me to her favorite hidden spots around the city: the used bookstore where she spent Sunday afternoons, the little Italian restaurant where the owner knew her by name, the park bench overlooking the river where she went to think. She let me into her world piece by piece, and I fell deeper with each new revelation. But there was one piece of her world she kept carefully guarded: her family. She mentioned her father occasionally, always with a note of tension in her voice that she tried to hide. She told me he was a businessman, that he owned several companies, that he had high expectations. She spoke about her mother with more warmth, describing her as sweet but passive, someone who had learned long ago that keeping the peace was easier than fighting battles she couldn't win. Her older brother, Thomas, was already working for their father, being groomed to take over the family business. Claire painted a picture of a family that functioned more like a corporation than a household, where love was conditional and approval had to be earned. I listened to all of this and felt nothing but sympathy. I had no idea that her father would become the architect of my destruction. I met Richard Thornton for the first time 6 months into my relationship with Claire. She had been putting it off, making excuses, and I had begun to suspect that she was ashamed of me. When I finally confronted her about it, tears welled in her eyes. She told me it wasn't shame, it was fear. She said her father had very specific ideas about who she should marry, and she was terrified of how he would react to us. But she also said she loved me, and she was tired of hiding. That was the first time either of us had used the word love, and it made everything else seem manageable. We agreed to have dinner at her parents' estate the following Sunday. I remember driving up to that house and feeling my confidence shrink with every passing second. The Thornton estate was exactly what you'd imagine when you picture old money. A sprawling property in the suburbs with manicured gardens and a driveway long enough to have its own security checkpoint. The house itself looked like something out of a period drama. All red brick and white columns and windows that seemed to stare down at visitors with quiet judgment. Claire squeezed my hand as we walked to the front door, and I tried to ignore the fact that my palms were sweating. Richard Thornton answered the door himself, which Claire later told me was unusual. He normally had staff for that. He was a tall man with silver hair and the kind of posture that suggested he had never doubted himself a day in his life. His handshake was firm, almost aggressive, and his eyes swept over me with an assessment that felt more like an appraisal. He welcomed me into his home with words that were polite enough, but his tone carried an undercurrent of skepticism that made my skin prickle. Claire's mother, Patricia, was the opposite. She was warm and gracious, complimenting my tie and asking about my work with genuine interest. But even as she spoke, I noticed the way her eyes kept flicking toward her husband, as if she was monitoring his reactions and adjusting her own behavior accordingly. Dinner was an interrogation disguised as casual conversation. Richard asked about my background, my family, my education, my career prospects. Each answer I gave was met with a nod that felt more like a dismissal. That when I mentioned that I was the first person in my family to graduate from college, he smiled and said that was admirable, but his tone suggested he found it more quaint than impressive. Claire tried to steer the conversation toward safer topics, but her father always found a way to bring it back to me, to my origins, to the gap between my world and theirs. By the time dessert was served, I knew exactly where I stood. Richard Thornton did not approve of me, and he had no intention of pretending otherwise. After dinner, while Claire was helping her mother in the kitchen, Richard invited me to his study for a drink. I knew it was a test, and I knew I had to pass it. His study was exactly what you'd expect from a man like him: dark wood paneling, shelves lined with leather-bound books, a massive desk positioned to make anyone sitting across from it feel small. He poured 2 glasses of whiskey and handed one to me without asking if I wanted it. Then he sat down behind his desk and looked at me with the calm confidence of a man who had never lost a negotiation in his life. He told me he appreciated my time and that he wanted to speak frankly. I said I appreciated frankness, though something in my gut told me I wasn't going to appreciate what came next. He told me that Claire was special, that she was the light of his life, that he had worked his entire career to give her the opportunities and protections that came with their family name. And then he told me, in that same calm voice, that he didn't believe I was the right match for her. He said it wasn't personal. He said it was simply a matter of compatibility. Claire had been raised in a certain world, and I hadn't. She had certain expectations for her future, and he doubted I could meet them. He told me that if I truly cared about her, I would think long and hard about whether I was prepared to give her the life she deserved. I sat there in silence, my whiskey untouched, feeling the rage build in my chest. But I kept my voice steady when I responded. I told him that I understood his concerns, but that Claire was an adult who could make her own choices. I told him that I loved his daughter and that I intended to build a life with her, whether he approved or not. I told him that where I came from, a man's worth was measured by his character, not his bank account. And then I stood up, set my untouched whiskey on his desk, and told him I thought it was time for us to leave. Claire was waiting in the foyer when I came out of the study, and one look at my face told her everything she needed to know. We drove home in near silence, but when we got back to my apartment, she broke down. She apologized over and over, saying she had known he would be difficult, but had hoped it would be different. I held her while she cried and told her that her father's opinion didn't matter to me. What mattered was us. What mattered was that we loved each other. Looking back now, I realized that was the moment Richard Thornton decided I was an enemy. I had challenged him in his own home, in front of his family. I had refused to be intimidated. And for a man who was used to controlling everything and everyone around him, that was an unforgivable sin. But I didn't know that then. I was young and in love and arrogant enough to believe that nothing could touch what Claire and I had built together. I had no idea that Richard was already planning my destruction. The next 2 years were the happiest of my life. Claire and I moved in together, got engaged, and planned a wedding that was far more modest than her family was used to. Richard made his displeasure known at every opportunity, but Claire stood firm. She told him that this was her life and her choice, and if he couldn't support her, she would marry me without his presence. That ultimatum seemed to work. He showed up on our wedding day with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, made a toast that was technically appropriate, but utterly devoid of warmth, and wrote us a check for our honeymoon that felt more like a transaction than a gift. I cashed it anyway. We needed the money, and I wasn't going to let his pettiness stop us from having the trip we dreamed about. We spent 2 weeks in Italy, wandering through Rome and Florence and the Amalfi Coast, completely wrapped up in each other. When we came home, we started building our life together. Claire continued teaching, and I threw myself into my work at the marketing firm, determined to advance quickly enough to provide for the family we planned to start. Things were good. Not perfect, because nothing ever is, but good in the way that matters. We had our disagreements, but we worked through them. We had our stresses, but we faced them together. I thought we were solid. I thought nothing could break us. The first sign of trouble came about 8 months after the wedding. I had been up for a major promotion, a senior account manager position that would have nearly doubled my salary. I was qualified, I had seniority, and my supervisor had all but promised me the role. But when the announcement came, the promotion went to someone else. A man named Bradley, who had been with the company half as long as I had, and who was, quite frankly, mediocre at his job. I was stunned. My supervisor seemed embarrassed when I asked him about it, saying only that the decision had come from above and was out of his hands. I tried to let it go, told myself that politics were part of any workplace, that I'd get the next opportunity. But something about it nagged at me. Bradley had connections. Everyone knew that. His father was friends with several of the partners. But even accounting for nepotism, the decision didn't make sense. I had brought in more revenue than anyone else on the team. My client satisfaction scores were impeccable. There was no logical reason to pass me over. I mentioned it to Claire that night, and she told me not to worry. She said there would be other opportunities. She seemed distracted, though, checking her phone throughout dinner. When I asked if everything was okay, She said her father had been texting her about some family matter. I didn't think much of it at the time. Over the next year, a pattern began to emerge. Every time I was in line for an advancement, something would go wrong. A client would suddenly become difficult. A project would hit unexpected obstacles. A rumor would circulate that I was difficult to work with or not ready for leadership. I started to feel like I was running on a treadmill, working harder than ever, but getting nowhere. Meanwhile, my relationship with Claire began to change in ways I couldn't quite identify. She was still loving, still supportive, but there was a distance between us that hadn't been there before. She started having dinner with her father more often, sometimes without me. She said it was because he was getting older and she wanted to mend their relationship. I thought that was healthy. I encouraged it. I had no idea what they were actually discussing during those dinners. What I didn't know, what I wouldn't discover until much later, was that Richard had never stopped fighting against our marriage. He had simply changed tactics. Instead of open opposition, he had shifted to something far more insidious. He had started a campaign to make me look like a failure, and he had started turning his own daughter against me. The first concrete evidence I had that something was wrong came from an unexpected source. A colleague named Angela, who worked in the accounting department, pulled me aside one afternoon and asked if I had a few minutes to talk privately. We went to a coffee shop down the street, and what she told me chilled me to the bone. Angela said she had been processing some expense reports and had noticed something unusual. There were payments being made to a consulting firm that she had never heard of, a firm called Cornerstone Advisory Group. When she dug deeper, she discovered that Cornerstone was connected to the Thornton family. Specifically, one of Richard's business associates sat on their board, and the services they were supposedly providing to our company were vague at best. She didn't know what any of it meant, but she knew I had some connection to the Thornton family through my marriage, and she thought I should know. I thanked her and told her I would look into it. But as I walked back to the office, my mind was racing. Why would Richard's associate be doing business with my company? And why would those payments be hidden in a way that someone had to actively dig to find them? I started paying closer attention after that conversation. I requested copies of old project files, ones from the accounts I'd worked on that had mysteriously gone sideways. I talked to clients who had suddenly become difficult and probed carefully about what had changed their minds. And slowly, a picture began to form. On 3 separate occasions, someone had contacted my clients after I had completed successful work for them. That someone had suggested subtly that I wasn't reliable, that my work quality was declining, that they might be better served by taking their business elsewhere or by working with a different account manager. I couldn't prove who was making those calls, but I had my suspicions. When I finally got the name of the consulting firm that one client had spoken to before dropping me, I felt the blood drain from my face. Cornerstone Advisory Group. Richard Thornton was sabotaging my career. He was paying people to undermine me, to poison my reputation, to ensure that I would never succeed at that company. And he was doing it all while pretending to have accepted our marriage. I didn't confront Claire immediately. I needed more information, more proof. But I started watching our interactions with new eyes, looking for signs that she knew what her father was doing. What I saw broke my heart. Claire had changed over the past year in ways I had been too blind to notice. She questioned me more often, asking pointed questions about my work, about why I hadn't been promoted, about our financial situation. She compared me, not directly but through implication, to her brother Thomas, who was thriving in the family business. She brought up the comfortable life her parents had given her and wondered aloud if we would ever be able to afford a house like she'd grown up in. Every time we argued about money, which was happening more and more frequently, she would retreat into a cold silence and then spend the next few days texting with her father. I started to realize that Richard wasn't just sabotaging my career. He was feeding Claire doubts about me. He was nurturing her insecurities, reminding her of what she had given up to be with me, and slowly convincing her that she had made a mistake. The breaking point came on a Wednesday evening in September, almost 3 years after our wedding. I came home from work to find Claire sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of papers in front of her. Her face was pale, and she had been crying. When I asked what was wrong, she pushed the papers toward me without a word. They were bank statements. Our bank statements. But something was wrong. There were withdrawals I didn't recognize, large sums of money transferred to accounts I had never heard of, thousands of dollars over several months, adding up to almost $40,000 in total. Claire told me, her voice shaking, that her father had hired someone to look into our finances. She said he had been worried about her, wanted to make sure she was being taken care of, and he had found this. She looked at me with eyes full of pain and accusation and asked me what I had done with the money. I stared at those papers, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I had not made those withdrawals. I had not transferred that money. I didn't even recognize the account numbers where the funds had supposedly gone. But there was my name right there on the statements. There were transactions that appeared to originate from our joint account, transactions I had never authorized. I tried to tell Claire that it wasn't me, that someone had done this, that the statements had to be fake or tampered with. But even as the words came out of my mouth, I could see that she didn't believe me. 3 years of her father's whispered poison had done their work. She no longer trusted me. She no longer saw me as the man she had married. She saw me as the failure her father had always told her I was. And now, apparently, I was a thief as well. She told me she needed space. She said she was going to stay with her parents for a while. She said she needed to think about whether our marriage could survive this. I begged her to listen, to let me investigate, to give me a chance to prove my innocence. But she just shook her head, picked up her bag, and walked out the door. I sat alone in that empty kitchen for hours, staring at those bank statements, my entire life crumbling around me, and for the first time since I was a child, I cried. The weeks that followed were a nightmare. Claire wouldn't take my calls. When I tried to visit her at her parents' house, the security guard turned me away at the gate. I went to my bank and demanded to know how those withdrawals had happened, but the investigation moved at a glacial pace. Meanwhile, the rumors at work intensified. People whispered when I walked by. My supervisor called me into his office and asked if there was anything I needed to disclose about my personal finances. Somehow, the story of my supposed theft had reached my workplace. I didn't need to ask how. Richard Thornton's reach extended everywhere. A week after Claire left, I received an envelope in the mail. It contained a letter from a law firm I'd never heard of, informing me that Claire was filing for divorce. The grounds cited were irreconcilable differences and financial misconduct. I read that letter over and over, trying to understand how my life had fallen apart so completely in such a short time. And then, finally, the rage broke through the grief. Richard Thornton had done this. He had engineered every step, from the career sabotage to the fake bank statements to the destruction of my marriage. He had played a long game, patient and methodical, and he had won. But as I sat in that empty apartment with that divorce letter in my hands, I made a decision. I was not going to let him get away with it. I was going to find proof of what he had done, and I was going to make him pay. My first call was to a man named Daniel Mercer. Daniel was a lawyer I had met a few years earlier at a networking event, and we had stayed loosely in touch. He was smart, principled, and most importantly, he had no connection to Richard Thornton or his world. I told him everything. I told him about the career sabotage, the poisoned relationships, the mysterious consulting firm, the fake bank statements. I told him about Claire leaving and the divorce filing, and I told him that I needed help. Daniel listened without interrupting, his expression growing more serious with each new revelation. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said 3 words that gave me more hope than I had felt in weeks. He said, "Let's find evidence." Daniel explained that proving what Richard had done would be difficult, but not impossible. We would need to trace the money, document the connections between Cornerstone Advisory Group and my workplace sabotage, and find proof that the bank statements had been fabricated. It would take time and resources, but if we could build a solid case, we could take Richard down. Not just socially, but legally, financial fraud, conspiracy, tortious interference with business relationships. The list of potential charges was long, and Daniel was confident we could make at least some of them stick. The next 6 months were the hardest of my life. I was going through a divorce that Claire's lawyers were making as painful as possible. I was fighting to keep my job as the rumors about my supposed financial misconduct continued to spread. And every spare moment I had was devoted to building the case against Richard. Daniel brought in a forensic accountant, a woman named Sarah Chen, who specialized in tracing hidden financial transactions. Within weeks, Sarah had identified significant irregularities in the bank statements Claire had shown me. The transfers I had supposedly made had originated from IP addresses that didn't match any device I owned. The receiving accounts, when traced far enough, led back to shell companies with suspicious ties to Thornton family businesses. Someone had gone to a lot of trouble to make it look like I was stealing money, but they hadn't been quite careful enough. Richard, for all his cunning, had made a critical error. He had assumed that I would simply accept defeat. He had assumed that a man from my background wouldn't have the resources or the will to fight back against someone like him. He had underestimated me. While Sarah traced the money, I focused on documenting the career sabotage. I tracked down former colleagues who had heard rumors about me and carefully interviewed them about where those rumors had originated. I obtained records from Cornerstone Advisory Group through a combination of legal requests and, honestly, some creative interpretation of information access laws. And I built a timeline that showed with damning clarity how Richard Thornton had systematically destroyed my professional reputation. Every setback I had experienced could be traced back to his influence. Every client who had been turned against me had been approached by someone connected to his network. Every promotion I had been denied had been blocked by pressure from above, pressure that ultimately led back to individuals with ties to Thornton Enterprises. It was a conspiracy so elaborate that at times I struggled to believe it myself. But the evidence was undeniable. Richard Thornton had declared war on me the day I married his daughter, and he had waged that war with the cold precision of a man who was used to destroying his enemies. The most painful part of the investigation was learning how deeply Claire had been involved. I had held on to hope that she was simply a victim of her father's manipulation, that once she learned the truth, she would come back to me. But as Daniel dug into the divorce proceedings, we discovered something that shattered that hope completely. Claire knew. Not everything, but enough. She had attended meetings with her father where they discussed how to make me look bad. She had helped him craft the narrative that I was a failure who couldn't provide for her. And she had known, when she showed me those bank statements, that her father had arranged for them to be created. She didn't know all the details of how he had fabricated the evidence, but she knew it wasn't real. She had lied to my face, pretended to be heartbroken by my supposed betrayal, and walked out knowing that she was the one betraying me. When I saw the evidence of her complicity, I felt something inside me go cold. I had loved this woman. I had built my life around her. And she had helped her father destroy me because, in the end, her loyalty to her family was stronger than her loyalty to our marriage. The Claire I had loved had never really existed. She was her father's daughter through and through. As our case strengthened, Daniel advised me to be strategic about when and how we revealed what we knew. Going public too soon could give Richard time to cover his tracks or retaliate. We needed to wait until we had everything in place, until our evidence was so overwhelming that no amount of money or influence could make it disappear. So I waited. I signed the divorce papers because fighting them would only delay our larger plan. I let Claire take half of our modest assets because I knew that soon enough the scales would be balanced. I even sat through a mediation session where Richard smirked at me across the table, secure in his victory. But every time I felt my resolve wavering, I thought about what he had done, not just to me, but to his own daughter. He had raised Claire to be a pawn in his games, had taught her that loyalty meant obedience, that family meant following his orders without question. He had corrupted everything he touched, and he had convinced himself that it was all justified because he was protecting her. The truth was, he was protecting his own ego. He couldn't stand the idea of his daughter choosing someone he hadn't approved. He couldn't accept that his control over her life had limits. And rather than let her be happy with a man he considered beneath her, he had chosen to destroy us both. That wasn't love. That was ownership. And I was going to make him understand the difference. The opportunity to strike came from an unexpected direction. Daniel had been monitoring Richard's business activities, looking for any leverage we might use. And he found something far more valuable than leverage. He found a pattern. Over the past decade, Richard Thornton had engaged in a consistent practice of financial manipulation. He had used his connections to sabotage competitors, bribed officials to secure contracts, and hidden assets in offshore accounts to evade taxes. What he had done to me wasn't an isolated act of vengeance. It was just one example of how he operated. Richard Thornton was, beneath his polished exterior, a criminal. The evidence Daniel compiled was enough to interest not just civil courts, but federal investigators. When we presented our findings to a contact Daniel had at the Department of Justice, their response was immediate. They had been looking into Thornton family businesses for years, but had never been able to make a case stick. Our evidence, combined with what they already had, changed everything. Richard Thornton wasn't just going to face consequences for what he did to me, he was going to face consequences for a lifetime of corruption. I wish I could say that watching Richard's empire crumble was purely satisfying. But the truth is more complicated. When federal agents showed up at the Thornton estate with a search warrant, I wasn't there to see it. I learned about it the way everyone else did, through news coverage that dominated the local media for weeks. Richard Thornton, beloved businessman and philanthropist, was being investigated for fraud, tax evasion, and conspiracy. The details that emerged were damning. Executives from his companies flipped on him to save themselves. Documents surfaced that showed decades of misconduct. And buried in all of that evidence was a detailed account of how he had tried to destroy his own son-in-law. The media loved that angle, the story of a powerful man so obsessed with control that he would fabricate evidence and sabotage an innocent person just because he disapproved of his daughter's husband. It painted Richard as not just a criminal, but a monster. And for once, the public perception matched the reality. Claire called me 3 weeks after the story broke. It was the first time I had heard her voice since she left, and the sound of it stirred something painful in my chest. She was crying. She said she had seen the coverage. She said she understood now what her father had done. She said she was sorry, so deeply sorry, for her part in it. She asked if there was any chance I could forgive her. I listened to her apology without interrupting. Part of me, the part that still remembered the woman I'd fallen in love with, wanted to believe her. Wanted to think that she had been manipulated just as thoroughly as I had been deceived. But I had seen the evidence. I knew the meetings she had attended, the lies she had told, the choices she had made. She wasn't an innocent victim. She was a collaborator. When she finished speaking, I was quiet for a long moment. Then I told her the truth. I told her that I had loved her more than I had ever loved anyone. I told her that I had believed in our marriage, in our future, in the life we were building together. And then I told her that what she and her father had done had killed something inside me. Not my capacity to love, but my ability to trust blindly. I told her that I couldn't forgive her, not because I was holding on to anger, but because forgiveness without accountability would be a lie. She had made her choices, and now she had to live with them. Then I hung up the phone and blocked her number. It was the last time we ever spoke. Richard's trial lasted 4 months. I testified 3 times, walking the court through every detail of what he had done to me. The prosecution used my case as an example of his broader pattern of behavior, showing the jury how a man who would destroy his own family member was clearly capable of the larger crimes he stood accused of. Richard's lawyers tried to paint me as a bitter ex-husband seeking revenge, but the evidence was too strong. The forensic analysis of those bank statements, the connections to Cornerstone Advisory Group, the documented timeline of career sabotage, none of it could be explained away. When the verdict came in, guilty on 17 counts, I was sitting in the back of the courtroom. I watched Richard's face as the forewoman read each count. Guilty, guilty, guilty. With each word, something in him seemed to shrink. The powerful man who had once looked down at me in his study, who had told me I would never be good enough for his daughter, now looked small and old and utterly defeated. He was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. Given his age, it was effectively a life sentence. After the trial, I focused on rebuilding my life. My reputation, which Richard had worked so hard to destroy, was restored. The company where I had worked issued a formal apology and offered me my job back, but I declined. I couldn't go back to a place so tainted by what had happened there. Instead, I started my own consulting firm using the skills I had developed and the contacts I had maintained. The first few years were difficult, but I was used to struggling. I had been fighting my whole life, and this was just another battle. Within 3 years, my firm was thriving. I had clients who respected me, employees who trusted me, and a life that I had built entirely on my own terms. Richard's attempt to prove that I was worthless had, ironically, made me stronger. Every obstacle he had thrown in my path had taught me something valuable. Every lie he had told had made me more determined to succeed. He had wanted to destroy me, and instead he had forged me into someone he could never touch. I met someone new about 2 years after the trial. Her name was Rachel, and she was nothing like Claire. She was direct where Claire had been subtle, independent where Claire had been sheltered, honest in a way that felt almost startling after everything I had been through. When I told her my story, she listened without judgment. She asked questions, not to probe for weaknesses, but because she genuinely wanted to understand. And when I finished, she didn't offer platitudes or false reassurances. She simply said that what happened to me was terrible and that she was glad I had made it through. That honesty, that willingness to see me as I was, rather than as she wanted me to be, was what made me fall in love with her. We got married last spring in a small ceremony with just our closest friends and family. No massive estate, no disapproving in-laws, no hidden agendas. Just two people making a promise to each other and meaning every word of it. I saw Claire one more time about a year ago. It was at a charity event, one of those awkward encounters where you spot someone across the room and there's nothing you can do but acknowledge their presence. She looked older than I remembered, though she was only in her mid-30s. The light that had first drawn me to her seemed to have dimmed. She was alone, which surprised me. After her father's conviction, most of her social circle had distanced themselves from the Thornton name. She had gone from being the daughter of a powerful man to being the daughter of a convicted criminal, and the fall from grace had clearly taken its toll. We exchanged polite words, the kind of surface-level conversation that strangers have. She congratulated me on my success, and I thanked her. She asked if I was happy, and I said yes. And then, because I couldn't help myself, I asked her the question I had been wondering about for years. I asked her why. Not why she had let her father manipulate her. I understood that. Family loyalty, especially in a household like hers, was a powerful force. But why had she believed the worst about me so easily? Why had she never given me the chance to defend myself? Why had the years we spent together, the love we had built, not been enough to make her question her father's lies? She was quiet for a long time before she answered. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. She said that she had always known, deep down, that I was too good for her world. She said she had spent our entire marriage waiting for the moment when I would realize that I could do better. Her father hadn't convinced her that I was a failure. He had simply confirmed what she had already feared, that I would eventually leave her for someone more suited to my ambitions. The lies he told about me stealing money, about my career struggles being my own fault, had given her a reason to be the one who left first. She said it was easier to believe I was bad than to face the possibility that she wasn't enough. It was the closest thing to honesty she had ever given me, and it was, in its own tragic way, the explanation I had needed. Claire hadn't betrayed me because she stopped loving me. She had betrayed me because she never believed she deserved to be loved. Her father had spent her entire life teaching her that love was conditional, that trust was a weakness, that the only way to survive was to strike first. And when he offered her a reason to destroy our marriage, she had taken it. Not out of malice, but out of fear. I told her that I understood, and I meant it. I understood, but I didn't forgive. Understanding and forgiveness are different things, and I had learned the hard way that giving the second without the first was just another form of self-destruction. Richard Thornton died in prison 18 months into his sentence. Heart attack, they said. I found out through a news alert on my phone, and I sat with the information for a long time before I felt anything at all. When the feeling finally came, it wasn't satisfaction or grief or relief. It was something closer to emptiness. This man had tried to destroy my life. He had manipulated his own daughter, betrayed every principle he claimed to value, and spent his final years behind bars because of his own hubris. And now he was gone, and none of it mattered anymore. The damage he had done couldn't be undone. The years I had lost couldn't be reclaimed. The trust that had been shattered would never fully heal. But I was still here. I was still standing. And that, in the end, was its own kind of victory. Richard Thornton had bet everything on breaking me, and he had lost. Not because I was stronger than him, but because I was more stubborn. He had expected me to accept his version of reality, to believe the lies he told about me, to slink away in defeat. Instead, I had fought back. I had exposed the truth, and I had built a life so far beyond what he thought I was capable of that his memory doesn't even cast a shadow on it. Sometimes, late at night, I think about what would have happened if I had listened to him at that first dinner, if I had walked away from Claire when he told me I wasn't good enough. Would I have been spared the pain of the years that followed? Probably. But I also would have missed the lessons that pain taught me. I would never have learned how strong I really was. I would never have met Rachel or built my company or discovered that my worth wasn't determined by what anyone else thought of me. Richard Thornton set out to punish me for defying him, and in doing so, he set me free. He forced me to face the worst parts of human nature and emerge on the other side with my soul intact. He tested me in ways I never could have imagined, and I passed, not because I'm a hero, but because I refused to let him define who I am. So if you're listening to this and you've been betrayed by someone who was supposed to love you, someone who was supposed to protect you, someone who used their power to try to break you, I want you to know something. You can survive it. You can fight back. You can reclaim your story from the people who tried to rewrite it. The truth has a way of coming out, no matter how deeply it's buried. And when it does, when the lies are exposed and the betrayers face their consequences, you will find a strength you never knew you had. My name is Marcus Bennett. My father-in-law tried to destroy me because I dared to love his daughter without his permission. And in the end, the only thing he destroyed was himself.